When I asked my son about his wedding date, my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "Oh, we already had the ceremony. Just close friends were invited." A week later, they called begging for rent money. I just laughed and said, "Funny, I save that for people who invite me to things." I, 56M, stared at my phone screen for what must have been the 10th time that morning, reading the same text message over and over. My son was asking if we could talk about something important. He wanted to come by the house that evening with his girlfriend. The message had that careful, diplomatic tone that immediately put me on edge. After 30 years of being a father, you develop instincts about these things. They arrived right on time. My son looked nervous, fidgeting with his car keys even after he'd pocketed them. His girlfriend had this practiced smile plastered across her face, the kind people wear when they're about to deliver news they think you should be grateful for. I offered them coffee, made small talk about traffic and weather, all while this knot tightened in my stomach. Eventually, my son cleared his throat and said they had something exciting to share. I felt myself lean forward slightly, expecting an engagement announcement. Instead, what came out of his mouth made me go completely still. They were already married. Had been for 2 weeks. The girlfriend, now apparently my daughter-in-law, jumped in quickly to explain. She said they wanted something intimate and meaningful, just their closest friends at a small ceremony downtown. Very modern, very them. She kept using words like authentic and intentional while my son nodded along, not quite meeting my eyes. The whole thing had been at a trendy loft space. Very Instagram-worthy, she assured me, as if that somehow made it better. I asked why I wasn't told beforehand. My son started to answer, but she cut him off, her smile never wavering. She explained that they didn't want any family drama or pressure. They wanted their special day to be about them, without having to worry about hurt feelings or family dynamics. The irony of that statement, given how I was feeling right then, seemed completely lost on her. I sat there processing this information while they waited for my reaction. My wife had passed away 4 years earlier from cancer. During those final months, she made me promise to stay close to our son, to not let the grief build walls between us. I'd kept that promise, or so I thought. We had dinner every other week. I'd helped him move into 3 different apartments. I'd co-signed his car loan when his credit wasn't quite good enough. And apparently, none of that had earned me a spot at his wedding. I asked about her family, whether her parents had been there. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. She explained stiffly that her parents were very traditional and wouldn't have approved of the venue or the casual nature of the ceremony. So no, they weren't invited either. At least I wasn't alone in being excluded, though that knowledge did absolutely nothing to ease the sting. My son finally spoke up, saying he hoped I understood. He added that they were planning a big reception later, maybe in a few months, where everyone could celebrate together. His voice had this pleading quality that made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. I told them congratulations, my voice flat. They left shortly after, the awkwardness thick enough to cut. The following days were strange. I went through my normal routine, but everything felt slightly off-kilter. I kept thinking about my own wedding, how proud my father had been walking around telling anyone who would listen that his son was getting married. How my mother had cried during the ceremony, happy tears that she didn't even try to hide. I'd assumed I'd have those same moments with my son. I called my brother and told him what happened. He was furious on my behalf, launching into a rant about disrespectful kids and participation trophies. But his anger, while validating, didn't actually help. My sister-in-law got on the phone and suggested that maybe this was just how young people did things now. She meant well, but her words felt like being patted on the head and told not to worry about it. A week passed. I'd just gotten home from the hardware store when my phone rang. It was my son. He sounded stressed, talking fast about how they'd had some unexpected expenses come up. The wedding had cost more than planned. Then his car needed new brakes. Their landlord had just increased the rent. They were short for the month, pretty significantly short. He asked if I could help them out, maybe loan them some money until they got back on their feet. I asked how much they needed. The number he quoted made me whistle low. That wasn't just rent money. That was rent plus utilities plus probably groceries and gas money too. He launched into explanations about security deposits and prorated amounts, but I wasn't really listening anymore. Something was clicking into place in my mind. I asked him about this reception he'd mentioned, the one where everyone would get to celebrate together. There was a pause. He admitted they'd decided not to do that after all. The wedding had been expensive enough, and they wanted to save money for other things. More practical things. His voice had that same careful tone from the earlier conversation, like he was trying to navigate a minefield. I told him I needed to think about it and would call him back. He started to protest, saying they really needed an answer soon because rent was due. I repeated that I'd call him back and ended the conversation. Then I sat in my kitchen, looking at the calendar on the wall where my wife used to mark all our important dates, where she would have circled my son's wedding day in bright red ink with exclamation points. The money they needed, I had it. I'd been setting aside money for years, actually. Money that was supposed to help with wedding expenses. My wife and I had started the fund when our son was in high school, adding to it regularly. After she died, I kept contributing to it, imagining the day I'd hand him a check and tell him it was from both of us. A final gift from his mother. I pulled up my banking app and looked at the wedding fund balance. It would have covered everything they spent, and then some. They could have had their intimate ceremony and not worried about the cost. Or they could have had something bigger if they'd wanted. The point was, they'd had options, and they'd chosen to exclude me from all of them. My son called again the next day, then the day after that. Each time his voice got a little more strained, a little more desperate. The girlfriend, my daughter-in-law, got on the phone during the third call. She tried a different approach, talking about family helping family, about how they'd always be there for me when I was older and needed help. The transactional nature of her pitch was almost impressive in its audacity. On the fourth day, they showed up at my house unannounced. I saw them through the window, arguing in the driveway about something before heading to the door. When I opened it, they both tried to smile, but the stress was evident. They said they were in the neighborhood and thought they'd stop by. Nobody believed that fiction, but we all pretended for a moment. We sat in the living room, the same room where they'd told me about the wedding. My son looked exhausted. She kept checking her phone, her leg bouncing anxiously. They made another pitch for the money, this time with more details about their financial situation. How they'd both have to pick up extra shifts. How they might lose their apartment. How stressful it all was. I let them finish. Then I asked them a question. I wanted to know who had been at their wedding. They exchanged a glance, and she started listing names. College friends mostly. Some coworkers. Her childhood best friend. A cousin of hers who was apparently cool and would have understood their vision. The list went on for a while. 15 people total at this intimate gathering. I asked how they decided who to invite. My son started to say something about keeping it small, but I cut him off. I pointed out that 15 people wasn't that small. It was selective. It was a choice. And they'd chosen to include a co-worker my son had known for 6 months, but not the father who'd raised him for 28 years. The daughter-in-law's face hardened. She said I was making this about me when they were in a genuine crisis. She suggested that maybe this was exactly why they'd wanted a drama-free ceremony, because they knew family would have expectations and make everything complicated. The words hung in the air like smoke. I told them about the wedding fund. Watching my son's face as I explained how long it had been building, how much was in it, seeing the realization dawn that they could have avoided all their current problems, that was something I'll never forget. He looked like I'd slapped him. His wife just looked angry, like I'd been withholding information that she was entitled to. She asked why I hadn't mentioned it before. I explained that I'd planned to give it to them when they announced their engagement to help them plan the wedding they wanted. But you couldn't give a wedding gift when you weren't invited to the wedding. You couldn't contribute to something you weren't included in. My son found his voice and said they could still use it now, for the rent and to get back on their feet. Then they could pay me back, and maybe we could all move past this. His wife nodded eagerly, already calculating in her head. I could tell. I smiled then. I'm not sure what my face looked like, but my son actually leaned back slightly. I told them that the wedding fund had a very specific purpose. It was for people who invited me to things. People who considered me important enough to share their major life moments. Since I apparently didn't qualify for that category, the money wasn't available to them. The daughter-in-law exploded. She called me petty and vindictive. She said I was punishing them for making a choice about their own wedding. She accused me of trying to control them with money. My son tried to calm her down, but she was on a roll, listing all the ways I was being unreasonable and hurtful. I waited for her to finish. Then I pointed out that actions have consequences. They'd made a choice about what I meant to them, and now I was making a choice about what they meant to me. I wasn't obligated to fund the lifestyle of people who couldn't even be bothered to send me a wedding invitation. Family helped family, she'd said earlier, but family also included family in important moments. My son tried a different angle. He brought up his mother, said she would have wanted me to help them. That was the wrong move. I stood up then, my voice harder than I'd intended. I told him his mother had made me promise to stay close to him, and I'd tried. But staying close was a two-way street. His mother would have been devastated to miss his wedding. She'd talked about it all the time during her illness, worried she wouldn't live to see it. And he'd gotten married without even telling me beforehand, like it was just another Tuesday. The silence that followed was deafening. My son's eyes were wet. His wife looked between us, finally seeming to understand that this wasn't a negotiation she could win. They left without another word. I watched them argue in the driveway again before driving off. Over the next week, I got messages from various people. Some mutual friends, confused about what was happening. A few relatives who'd heard bits and pieces of the story. My son had apparently been making calls, trying to find someone who could either give them money or convince me to change my mind. The campaign wasn't going well for them. My brother called to check on me. He'd spoken to my son, heard his version of events. He asked if I was really going to hold this grudge. I told him it wasn't a grudge. A grudge was petty and irrational. This was a boundary. I was simply matching their energy, treating them with the same level of consideration they'd shown me. 2 weeks after they'd asked for money, I got a message from my son. Just him this time, not his wife. He said they'd figured out the rent situation, borrowed from her parents, and picked up extra shifts. He also said he understood why I was hurt, and that maybe they'd made a mistake. Not an apology exactly, but closer than I'd expected. I didn't respond immediately. I thought about my wife, about the promises I'd made her. I thought about the kind of relationship I wanted with my son going forward. And I thought about self-respect, about not teaching people that they could treat you however they wanted without consequences. 3 days later, I replied. I told him I was glad they'd sorted out their financial situation. I also told him that the wedding fund still existed, but its purpose had changed. I was going to donate it to a cancer charity in his mother's name. She'd have liked that better anyway. If he wanted to rebuild our relationship, genuinely rebuild it, I was open to that. But it would take time and effort from both of us, and it wouldn't come with a checkbook attached. His response came quickly. He said he'd like to try, but his wife was still angry and felt disrespected. I told him that was between him and his wife to work out. I'd raised him to be his own person, capable of making his own decisions. If he wanted a relationship with his father, he needed to decide that for himself, not let someone else decide for him. A month passed with sporadic messages. Surface-level stuff mostly. Then one evening, my son showed up alone. He looked thinner, tired. We talked for 3 hours. Really talked, not the careful diplomatic conversations we'd been having. He admitted that his wife had pushed hard for the small wedding, had convinced him that it would be simpler and less stressful. He'd gone along with it because he didn't want conflict, but he'd regretted it almost immediately and had been too proud to admit it. I told him about watching his mother die, about how her biggest fear wasn't death itself, but missing out on the life he'd live after she was gone. How she'd made me write down all the advice she wanted to give him, all the moments she wanted to be part of. His wedding had been at the top of that list. He cried then, the kind of crying he hadn't done since he was a child. He apologized, actually apologized, for how everything had gone down. He said his marriage was already strained, that his wife couldn't understand why he was so upset about my reaction. She thought he should just cut me off entirely if I wasn't going to help them financially. They were in counseling, trying to work through it. I asked him what he wanted, really wanted, not what anyone else thought he should want. He said he wanted his dad back. He wanted to be able to call me when something good happened or when he needed advice. He wanted to stop feeling like he had to choose between his wife and his family. We didn't fix everything that night. You can't undo that kind of hurt with one conversation. But it was a start. I told him he was always welcome in my home, but I had limits now. I wouldn't be disrespected or taken for granted. If his wife wanted to be part of my life, she needed to make an effort too. Not because I was demanding it, but because that's how relationships worked. He asked about the wedding fund. I told him the truth. I'd already started the process of setting up the donation to the cancer charity. That money was gone as far as our relationship was concerned. He nodded, said he understood. Then he asked if we could have dinner the following week, just the two of us. I said yes. Things are still complicated. My daughter-in-law and I maintain a polite distance. She's civil when necessary, but hasn't made any real overtures. My son comes by every couple of weeks. We're rebuilding, slowly. It's not what I imagined my relationship with my married son would look like, but it's honest at least. The wedding fund donation went through last month. The charity sent a certificate with my wife's name on it, acknowledging the gift. I hung it in my office, right next to our wedding photo. Sometimes I look at it and wonder what she'd think of how everything played out. I like to believe she'd understand. She always did have a strong sense of what was right and what wasn't. My son saw the certificate during his last visit. He stood looking at it for a long time before telling me it was a good thing I'd done, that his mom would be proud. I told him she'd be proud of him too, for trying to make things right. We didn't talk about the wedding or the money or any of it. We just had dinner and watched a game and acted like father and son. That's enough for now. Maybe it'll be enough for always. Time will tell.